Queen Anne, 18th century, England. Presentation by G. Sowdambika, Guest Lecturer, English Department, CPA College, Bodinayakanur. 18th century, England. In 1702, Queen Anne became her regent. George I became king in 1714. He was also the ruler of Hanover, the part of Germany, and he much preferred to stay there. George could not speak English and was content to leave the running of Britain to his ministers. In 1711, the South Sea Company was formed. It was given exclusive rights to trade with the Spanish colonies in South America. It transported many slaves from Africa to South America. In 1720, shares in the company became massively overpriced. Then the share price collapsed. The South Sea bubble burst, and many investors lost huge sums of money. From 1721, Robert Walpole, his year is 1676 to 1745, became the king's chief minister. People began to call him Prime Minister. Originally, it was a term of abuse, not an official title. Walpole moved into Downing Street in 1735. 10 Downing Street became the Prime Minister official residence in 1732. George I died in 1727 and was succeeded by his son George II. Like his father, George II was content to leave government largely in the hands of his ministers. However, he was the last British king to lead an army into battle. He led them to victory against the French at Deddington in June 1743. Religion in the 18th century. In the early 18th century, England was notable for its lack of religious zeal. Most people went to church on Sunday, but very often they were indifferent. Some of the clergy continued to do good work, but generally there was a lack of energy in the church. This began to change in the 1730s. First, a man named John Whitefield, the year is 1742, 1770, became a great preacher. It was said that could preach to crowds of 20,000 people without a microphone. Then in 1738, John Wesley, his year is 1703 to 1791, founded the Methodists. Wesley did not want to break with the Church of England. He wanted his followers to remain within it, but in the end, this proved impossible and the Methodists were forced to become a separate denomination. Meanwhile, at the end of the 18th century, religious enthusiasm began to revive. Within the Church of England, there were a number of evangelists campaigning for an end of slavery. The Agricultural Revolution. In 1701, Jethro Tull invented the sheet drill. This machine dropped sheets at a controllable rate in the straight lines. A harrow at the back of the machine covered the seeds to prevent birds eating them. Tull also invented a horse-drawn hoe, which killed weeds between rows of seeds. New forms of crop rotation were introduced under the old system Land was divided into 3 fields and each year one was left fallow. This was obviously wasteful. In the 17th century, the Dutch began to use new forms of crop rotation with clover and root crops such as turnips and Swedes instead of letting the land grow fallow. Root crops restored fertility to the soil. In the 18th century, these new methods became common in England. A man named Charles Turnip Townshend did meant to popularize growing turnips. Turnips had another advantage. They provided winter feed for cattle. Previously, most cattle were slaughtered food to keep them through the season. Now fresh milk and butter become available all year round. Moreover, in the early 18th century, farmers began to improve their livestock by selective breeding. One of the most famous pioneers of selective breeding was Robert Backwell. Finally, in the 18th century, there was a wave of enclosures. When an act of enclosure was passed, commissioners divided up the land in the village so each farmer had all his land in one place. In 1756, Britain became embroiled in the 7 Years' War. The yearly is 1756 to 1763 with France. They won a great victory of Quebec that ensured that Canada became a British colony rather than a French one. Meanwhile, in 1760, George II died at the age of 17. George III succeeded him. The first two charges were content to leave government in the hand of their ministers. However, according to his enemy, George III tried to gain more power for himself. During his reign, Britain lost her colonies in North America. Fighting began in 1775 and the colonists declared themselves independent in 1776. George was determined to suppress the colonists, ignoring the wishes of those who wanted reconciliation. However, the Americans won the decisive victory at Yorktown in 1781, which ensured their independence. Meanwhile, London was rocked by the anti-Catholic Gordon riots in 1780. Riots were common in the 18th century. The workers could not vote and there were no trade unions. So if the workers were dissatisfied, they rioted. The Gordon riot was the worst. Lord George Gordon, 1751 to 1793, was an MP who led a huge crowd to Parliament to present a petition demanding the repeal of 1778 Act, which removed certain restrictions on Roman Catholics. The demonstration became a riot with cries of "No property." The rioters held London for several days until the army restored order. About 300 people died in the rioting. The Industrial Revolution, the most important revolution in that period. In the late 18th century, everyday life in Britain was transformed by the Industrial Revolution. Towns, industry and trade had been growing for centuries, but about 1780 economic growth took off. A number of technological advances made the revolution possible. The first industry to become mechanized was the textile industry. In 1771, Richard Arkwright opened a cotton spinning mill with a machine called a water frame, which was powered by a water mill. Then in 1779, Samuel Crampton invented a new cotton spinning machine called a spinning mill. Finally, in 1785, Edmund Cartwright invented a loom that would be powered in a steam engine. As a result of these new inventions, cotton productions boomed. During the 19th century, Britain was transformed by the Industrial Revolution. In 1801, at the time of first census, only about 20% of the population lived in towns. By 1851, the 50 years later, the figure had risen to over 50%. In 1881, about two-thirds of the population lived in towns. The reason is industrious. The industrious revolutions give the population high in towns. Society in 18th century Britain. Britain built up a great overseas empire. The North American colonies were lost after the War of Independence 1776 to 1783. On the other hand, after the 7 Years' War 1756 to 1763, Britain captured Canada and India. Britain also took Dominica, Grenada, Saint Vincent and Tobago in the West Indies. In 1707, the Act of Union was passed. Scotland was united with England and Wales. England became part of Great Britain. In the mid-18th century, the population of Britain was about 6.1 by 2 million. In the late 18th century, it grew rapidly and by 1801, it was over 9 millions. Owning land was the main form of wealth in the 18th century. Political power and influence was in the hands of rich landowners. At the top were the nobility, below them were a class of nearly rich landowners called the gentry. However, other middle class people such as merchants and professional men become richer and more numerous, especially in the towns. Below them were the great mass of the population, craftsmen and laborers. Homes in 18th century Britain. In the 18th century, a tiny minority of the population lived in luxury. The rich built great country houses. The wealthy owned comfortable furniture. However, the poor had none of these things. Craftsmen and laborers lived in 2 or 3 rooms. The poorest people lived in just 1 room. Their furniture was very simple and plain. Clothes in the 18th century Britain. Men wore knee-length trousers like garments called breeches and stockings. They also wore waistcoats and frock coats. They wore linen shirts. Both men and women wore wigs, and for men 3-cornered hats were popular. Men wore buckled shoes. Women wore stays. Stays means a bodice with strips of wool band and hooped petticoats under their dresses. Women in the 18th century did not wear knickers. Fashionable women carried folding fans. Fashion was very important to the 18th century, but poor people's clothes hardly changed at all. Leisure in 18th century Britain. Traditional games remained popular in the 18th century. These included games such as chess, drafts, and backgammon. There are also tennis and rough version of football. Horse racing was carried on for centuries before the 18th century, but this time it became a professional sport. The Jockey Club was formed in 1727. The Derby began in 1780. For the rich, card games and gambling were popular. The theatre was also popular. In London, pleasure gardens were created. Reading was also a popular pastime in the 18th century, and the first novels were published at this time. Books were still expensive, but in many towns you could pay to join a circulating library. The first daily newspaper in England was printed in 1702. The Times began in 1785. Rich people liked fox hunting. Public executions were also popular and they drew large crowds. 18th century education. In the early 18th century, charity schools were founded in many towns in England. They were sometimes called blue coat schools because of the color of the children's uniforms. Boys from well off families went to grammar schools. Girls from well off families also went to the school, but it was felt important for them to learn accomplishments like embroidery and music rather than academic subject. However, non-compromised of dissenters, Protestants who did not belong to the Church of England, were not allowed to attend most public schools. Instead, they went to their own dissenting academies. Philosophy. The Age of Enlightenment, or simply the Enlightenment or Age of Reason, was a cultural movement of intellectuals in 18th century Europe and the American colonies. Its purpose was to reform society using reason rather than tradition, faith, and revolution, and advance knowledge through science. It promoted science and intellectual interchange and opposed superstition, intolerance, and some abuses by church and state. John Locke was one of the most influential Enlightenment thinkers. He influenced other thinkers such as Rousseau, Voltaire, among others. He is one of the dozen or so thinkers who are remembered for their influential contributions across a broad spectrum of philosophical subfields. He is still known today for his liberalism in political theory. The main goal that most people remember about him in his famous words life, liberty, and property. With property, he stated that it is a natural right derived from labor. Thank you so much.